My name is Tom Sullivan. I am one of the co-coordinators of 350.org New Mexico. 350 is an international organization that's dedicated wholly to solving the climate crisis and preventing catastrophic global warming. There's a chapter in New Mexico, and we are the New Mexico chapter of 350.org. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about solutions to the climate crisis in New Mexico. And my talk is really divided into these three pieces. We're going to talk about the facts, basic facts of the climate science, and show you the data that says that the Earth is warming and what are the causes and effects. I'm going to talk about what must be done, what technological fixes and changes in our society are required in order for our survival. And I'm going to talk about what we can do right here in New Mexico, and really politically, what is it that needs to happen in order for us to make the changes that must be made. So the summary message that I'll kind of return to is we do have a path forward. The path forward is to, one, elect climate activists into political leadership, push through policy solutions like the Green New Deal, put a price on carbon emissions, convert to 100% renewable electricity, and then convert all of our uses of electricity or energy into that clean renewable electricity and stop burning fossil fuels, and then implement the broad base of solutions that are in this great document called Drawdown, which is the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reduce global warming. And if you're interested in it, I highly recommend the book. Unfortunately, we're going to have to keep at it for the rest of our lives. So we can get back below 350 parts per million, which is what 350.org stands for. And that is the maximum level of safe level of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere before we get significant global warming. Warming is happening now. So this is the beginning of part one. This is the climate science. This is a chart that shows you kind of the deviation from the mid-century average in terms of degrees Celsius on this axis, going all the way back to 1880, and you can see it's been warming and warming and warming as the Industrial Revolution progressed, and then we burned more coal and more oil and more natural gas, and it's been warming all the way up until in these last 5 years, they have been the hottest years that we have ever seen in the climate record, and we are just about at a full 1 degree Celsius of warming nationally. So that is the undeniable data. It's from the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. It's duplicated by scientific organizations all over the world. And the fundamental driver for this is the fact that carbon dioxide levels, which is one of the primary heat-trapping greenhouse gases, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has risen way above where it's been throughout all of human history. This is a chart that goes back 800,000 years. Parts per million of CO2 on the vertical axis. Throughout, for 800,000 years, as far as we can go back in the glacial record, we never saw concentrations of CO2 above 300 parts per million in the atmosphere. Well, today we are way above that, about 414 parts per million, and it's growing at 2 to 3 parts per million every year towards catastrophic levels. If the projections are right, the end of this century could see us at levels above 550, 600, all the way up possibly to 900 parts per million of carbon dioxide on our current path, and that's where we're headed unless we stop burning fossil fuels. This is the trajectory that we're on unless we change. And that spells the end of human civilization and everybody that you know and love. So who's ever been to a greenhouse or a hothouse and seen where they grow vegetables? Raise your hand. So you've experienced the greenhouse effect. And so the greenhouse effect occurs because you've got an enclosure that takes sunlight from the atmosphere, it brings it into that enclosure, it warms up inside, but that heat can't escape as easily as it came in because of the glass, because of the plastic, whatever it is. That's what a greenhouse does. Carbon dioxide in our atmosphere does the exact same thing. It acts as a reflector to prevent the absorbed heat from the sun from easily going back out into space, which it normally would, and then it warms the planet. And the more carbon dioxide you have in the atmosphere, the more this happens, and that is what is happening. So the impacts of that are being felt now in terms of wildfires and heat waves and drought and superstorms and famine in the Middle East and massive wildfires all over, including California, and the catastrophic hurricanes that we saw in 2017 with Hurricane Harvey, of which this is a photograph, Irma and Maria, and the California wildfires, and then in 2018, Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Michael. Just in those last 2 years, if you add up the economic damage from just that handful of climate-driven disasters, you're talking about $500 billion of damage to the U.S. economy. So we are already seeing the impacts of the climate crisis. And when people ask, what's it going to cost to save it? Well, that's what we save if we prevent it from getting worse. And it goes on and on. Every time I do this presentation, I have to add new slides. This is what's happening right now in the spring of 2019. This happens to be a photograph in the Midwest in Nebraska. Massive amounts of flooding because of the increase in moisture in the atmosphere, which I'll explain shortly. This is the forecast from NOAA on a probability of flood levels in the Midwest, and they're higher than they've been, and they will get higher as time goes on. And this is just one of the consequences of global warming. Last September, Hurricane Florence hit North Carolina, a massive category, I think it was 4 when it hit the North Carolina coast, caused major amounts of flooding, including to the pig farms, of which they had like 60 or more in North Carolina, and the coal-fired power plants where they have big coal ash ponds, where they have all that debris. All of that stuff rose up out of those ponds because of those floodwaters, and then it streams through the rivers after people wandered around in it, splashing around in it for days and days and in their living rooms, and then you can see all that toxic pollution going out into the Atlantic Ocean. This is what happens with global warming. The reason why we're seeing so much flooding is because 93% of all the heat energy from global warming is actually absorbed into the oceans. Right? It's some of it in the atmosphere, 7%. 93% of it goes into the oceans, and what that does is it makes hurricanes stronger. So a hurricane that might have been a Category 1 turns into a Category 3 hurricane. A Category 3 turns into a Category 5, because that heat energy from the oceans is what fuels the power of a hurricane. It makes hurricanes last longer, so that as they move north, those warmer waters that are warmer, farther north than they normally would have been, allows hurricanes to continue to be hurricanes as they go north all the way into Vermont. And that has happened. It also increases evaporation because of, warmer oceans cause more evaporation, putting moisture up into the sky, and the air's carrying capacity for moisture also increases with the warming, so it holds more moisture. All of that causes more rainfall, and you see these effects when when flooding and big rainfall events occur. Finally, the melting Arctic ice cap is slowing the jet stream so that hurricanes, when they occur, don't move as fast because they're pushed along by the jet stream, and they slow and they stall over land, causing more rainfall and flooding. All of these things add up to cause these catastrophic hurricanes that we've seen. And then there's the wildfires. So this one has some personal resonance to me because my daughter lives right there in San Francisco, and she breathed the smoke from this big fire that destroyed Paradise, California last November. Destroyed a town of 27,000 people, 13,000 homes were destroyed, 153,000 acres burned, and 83 people were killed, many of them in their cars, in their homes, trying to escape the wildfire as it roared through their town at freight train speeds, and they were just caught, burned alive in their cars. Climate disasters, of course, get paid for by the insurance industry, so they track the data. And this is from the Insurance Information Institute. They categorize, major events, catastrophes, into geographic, storms, floods, and drought. And the geophysical events like earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanoes have been flat during the 1980s, right? We're really not seeing a change, so that's kind of a controlled baseline. What you're seeing in this increase of 3x since the 1980s is increase in storms and in floods, and in drought, all effects of global warming. 75% of the ice in the North Pole is gone. This is what the satellite view of the North Pole looked like in terms of the extent of the ice in 1979. In 2018, it was about half of that lateral extent, but the thickness of the ice is also down by about a factor of 2. So you add those things together, 75% of all of the ice on the North Pole is gone, and it is on its way to disappearing completely fairly soon. And one of the effects of that is that, of course, the North Pole and the Arctic is much warmer than it normally would have been, and that is slowing down the jet stream. The jet stream is this band of wind that circles the Earth, and it's stabilized by the very cold North Pole and the temperature difference between the North Pole and the mid-latitudes. When the North Pole gets warmer, it disrupts the flow of the jet stream, and it slows, and it gets these wavy things. You may have heard the term polar vortex, causing strange weather events in the winter. It's happening all the time now. And this new study published in Science says greenhouse gases are increasingly disrupting the jet stream, which is a powerful river of winds that steers weather systems in the northern hemisphere, that is causing more frequent summer droughts, floods, and wildfires. And of course, we're seeing the effects here in New Mexico as well. The summers are getting hotter. This particular season, we've had a little bit more rainfall than recently, but the long-term trend is increased drought. We're seeing shorter, warmer winters, higher temperatures, reduced rainfall, increases in wildfires, insect infestation. Our pine forests are under insect attack because the pine beetle that normally would die over the winter months as they got really cold and it killed them. Now it's warmer enough in the winter that they survive those winters, and they're eating up our pine forests. So this is a chart most fundamental to climate science. It's called the Keeling curve. It's the chart of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. It is put on the top of a Mauna Loa observatory in the Hawaiian Islands about 1958 by Dr. Charles Keeling. And we have concentration levels that date back through other means all the way back to about 1700. The real-time data started in 1958, and you can see that it grew and grew kind of slowly, and it has really taken off as much of the world is being industrialized. People are buying more cars, they're consuming more energy, which means you burn more coal and natural gas. We are now seeing carbon dioxide levels increase about 2 parts per million every year. I said that throughout all of human history, we never saw CO2 levels above 300 parts per million. Well, we passed that, in the 1900s, past 350 in 1988, and our forecast right now is that by the mid-2030s, we will surpass this danger level of 450 parts per million. And somewhere around 2035, if you just extrapolate that curve and say, well, when's it going to hit? 2035, plus or minus, that's the trend that we are on. And I'm pointing out this number because climate scientists and all their published studies correlate the concentration of CO2 at 450 parts per million as driving the dangerous level of 2 degrees Celsius, double what we are today, and the level that every government in the world got together for the Paris Climate Accords and said we must not exceed 2 degrees Celsius. Well, we are on a path to lock ourselves into that in just 16 years from now, on the path that we are on. So what we have to do, what we must do, is to stop burning fossil fuels, stop emitting all of that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, bend that curve over before it gets to 450 parts per million, and hopefully have a climate where our children can survive. So, there is a lot of information in climate publications and the science that get published and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's dense and it's hard to read, so I have conveniently put it all on this one-page chart for you. So this is the worst-case forecast that climate science say is going to happen by decade throughout the 2060s, from now, 2020, through the 2060s. As warming gets to 1 degree Celsius, we're just about there right now. By the 2030s, we'll definitely be between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius. There's no way to avoid that. This red line here, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees C, is what we're locked into now. There is no way to avoid that much warming. There's so much CO2 in the atmosphere already, and the lag of warming versus the CO2 buildup will drive us there. So we're already locked into something like this level of climate effects. Every year that we keep burning CO2 and add another 41 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that red line marches down another year, and another year, and another year. So in the 2030s, we will see a drop in our ability to grow the most fundamental food crops that sustain life on this earth. I'm talking about rice and corn and wheat and soybeans. Of 20% is what scientists forecast. 20% drop in our food crops in the 2030s between 1 and 2 degrees C. If we pass 2 degrees Celsius, our ability to grow food will drop by 30% in terms of crop yields, and that's a result of just drought and heat waves primarily. We are already starting to see major food shortages of corn and wheat. Some reasonable ones. We're at the 10% level right now. It gets worse in the 2030s. If we cross 2 degrees Celsius, we will see most summers hotter than the European heat wave of 2003, which killed somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people in Europe due to just heat effects. 30% of all species of life on Earth are at risk of extinction past 2 degrees Celsius. Wildfires 4 to 8 times worse, drought in the subtropics, and the beginning of extensive starvation, and somewhere on the order of 10 million climate refugees start to hit around this level. It gets worse, it gets into the 100 million level past this level. And some scientists are forecasting that because of this drop in crop yields, we will cross a threshold of what they call a food deficit globally, which means you literally can't grow enough calories on this planet to feed the 9 billion souls that we have today, and another, maybe 1 billion that will come along by then. So what happens when you have a global food deficit? You have starvation, because you've got too many people, you don't have enough food. The math says that's what results. And it gets worse from there, and I don't even want to talk about it because it's too depressing. So this is the future that we are building for our children. So when people ask you, what is it going to cost to solve the climate crisis? What's it worth to all of our children to prevent them from inheriting this future? Anything. Anything. Certainly worth another 5 cents a kilowatt hour on your electric bill. So we've been doing polling for climate change and global warming for quite some time. This is from the Yale organization. Yale 360 does a great climate communications publication. And they showed most recently, last December, that the number of, percentage of people significantly worried about global warming is growing pretty rapidly because of all of these very obvious effects that we're seeing. And most significantly, the percentage of people that are very worried or alarmed has about tripled from 11% to 29%, as they should. And of course, it's the young people who are the most concerned because they get to inherit most of this future. Finally, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report last October on, it was called Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was the difference between, what does a 1.5 degree C world look like versus 2 degrees C. And so it got a significant amount of press, finally. One of the headlines came out that we have 12 years left. You may have heard that term. We have 12 years left to act decisively to basically prevent this climate catastrophe. And what that really means is we have 12 years left to cut global carbon dioxide emissions in half by 2030, and half again by 2040, and to zero by 2050. And this is a chart of CO2 emissions following a lot of their different climate models, showing that we currently emit about 41 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. And this is what the trajectory needs to be if we want to survive needs to cut down to about 20 gigatons a year by 2030 and to 0 in 2050. So when you hear these terms about we have 12 years left, this is what they mean and this is what we have to do. So that was the end of part one. I'm going to talk about some solutions from here on. So the greenhouse gas emissions, according to a 2016 EPA report, showed that this is the kind of the composition of what those greenhouse gases look like. This is what we're emitting, at least from this country. 82% of all of those greenhouse gas emissions are carbon dioxide. And that comes from burning coal, oil, and natural gas. Another 10% is methane, or otherwise known as natural gas. Nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases form the remainder. And the economic sectors from which those emissions arise, 28% from transportation, a similar amount from generating electricity, and that's where we burn oil, gasoline, or diesel, and coal and methane to generate electricity. And then in industry, they use natural gas for heating and other industrial uses. They burn some oil. Agriculture, most of that emissions comes from changes in land use patterns and from the emissions from cows. The methane primarily, and then methane mostly from the commercial and residential sector. So this is where those greenhouse gas emissions, this is where they need to be cut from. So, if you look at all of the proposals, you can kind of boil down the solutions into four main categories, which is 80% or more of everything that has to be done. First, you have to convert to 100% renewable electricity generation, solar, wind, geothermal, hydropower, all of that stuff that doesn't emit carbon dioxide. Then you have to electrify everything that we use. So your nice gas range that you use to cook your food on, that's got to go. We have to convert all of our space heating and water boilers from using methane to using electricity. And then we have to electrify transportation is probably the #1 source of that. Change the way we're using our land and go to regenerative agriculture and change to a sustainable food system. And just like in the Medicare for All transition that we just heard about, there needs to be a just transition for all the people currently employed in these industries to make sure that the affected workers, their needs are taken care of, as well as the communities that they work in, because there's going to be a significant amount of economic transition. Fortunately, in this last election, we were able to elect a different government in the state of New Mexico. Governor Lujan Grisham ran on a platform of addressing the climate crisis, making this a renewable energy state, and with her leadership and a whole bunch of environmental allies, of which I was one, we worked to pass the Energy Transition Act and got it signed this last March of 2019. And that requires our electric utilities and our rural co-ops to get on a path to get off of coal, get off of natural gas, and to build a whole bunch of solar and wind and geothermal and replace our energy system of generating electricity in the state with 100% renewables on the scale of 2045, at least for the utilities. So that was a major, major step in the right direction. We worked on that for 3.5 years. One thing that we have in our favor, of course, with renewable electricity is that it has gotten really cheap. This is just the trend over the last 9 years in costs for wind. 69% drop in the cost of wind power over the last 9 years. Drop of solar energy and 88% over the last 9 years. To the point where, according to Lazard Investments in Banking, onshore wind is the cheapest form of electricity. Utility scale solar energy is the second cheapest, and it is now cheaper, as P&M recently found, to shut down an old coal-fired power plant and replace it with renewable energy because this has gotten so cheap. It is more expensive to just keep operating an old coal plant than to replace it with solar and wind. So that's a good thing. So one of the objections that you hear from the fossil fuel industry is, oh, well, the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. It's intermittent. You can't rely on these resources. So individually, by themselves, that is true. But taken together, solar plus wind are two very complementary resources. And this is a chart from the U.S. Department of Energy plotting the average generation from solar and wind across a 24-hour day. So you're at midnight and noon, back to midnight. Solar energy, of course, comes on as the sun rises and stays during the course of the day. Wind, it turns out, actually generates more of its electricity during the nighttime, and also generates more of its electricity during the winter, when the days are shorter and the sun doesn't shine as much. So if you average those two things, add those two things together, the profile of wind plus solar is this blue line, which very closely matches the demand profile during the day. So that is the benefit of building them together as complementary resources. We will probably need some storage to fill in some gaps, but the need for storage is overblown and it is not as soon. You probably don't need significant grid scale storage until you get past 50% grid penetration, which is about a decade away. So that's a factor in our favor. Here's another one. The land energy impact of going to 100% renewable energy is actually tiny relative to what we're doing today. So the land use impact of oil and gas extraction alone impacts 1% of all land in the U.S. from well pads and pipelines and the roads connecting the well pads and all of the damage they do to our natural environment. If you add up rooftop PV, utility scale solar plants, and just where the pole of wind turbine hits the ground, and you add all that up together, 0.4% of the land area of the United States would be required to supply 100% of all energy uses for all purposes for this country. And I'm not talking just electricity, I'm talking transportation, I'm talking industrial heating, home, hot water and space heating, all of that together. This is data from the Solutions Project out of Stanford University. So, something that we should go pursue. Bear with me while I get my mouse working again. So, and that is of course compared to the land and sea impact of fossil fuels today. Here's another interesting fact for you. The United States uses nearly 3 times more land at 33 million acres to grow just corn for ethanol fuel than would be required for all solar farms together. How do you pay for it? Well, here's one way. We provide enormous amounts of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry today. A fully mature industry, well over 100 years old. They do not need our tax money. They don't need tax breaks to continue to operate, but they are very politically powerful, so they get them passed through the Congress. If we were to just redirect the fossil fuel subsidies that currently support the fossil fuel industry, including the level of climate damage that they're doing, we would be able to pay for all of the transition to 100% clean renewable energy. This is according to a study that came out of a consortium of universities from University of Sydney, the German Aerospace Center, and Australia. So that was kind of phase one. That's how we convert to 100% renewable energy generation. That is what we need to do as step one. The second phase is to electrify every use of our energy so that we stop using fossil fuels and we're basically just consuming clean, renewable electricity. This is one example of a timeline and kind of the scope of what needs to happen, put out by a very good climate writer named Dave Roberts. So we're talking, over time. This doesn't have to happen immediately. It needs to happen aggressively, but not all at once. And so we start off with sources of methane use in our homes, like heating and drying and cooking, in residential and commercial sectors, all new buses and trains, heavy-duty trucks, light-duty electric vehicles, small marine vehicles, and because it's going to take a while to develop, aircraft that don't use fossil fuels, that use either electricity or sustainable biofuels, that's probably out of the 2035 to 2040 time frame. But this is what a kind of a time frame and the scope of the change that we're talking about. Can be done if we're serious. And of course the electric vehicle revolution is already underway. When I pulled up here today, I was gratified to see 3 electric cars out in the parking lot. And so the growth of electric vehicles worldwide is phenomenal. It is exponential. It is growing at a compounded annual growth rate of 60% per year from 2012 through 2018. That's the case. 61% actually, and more than half of that growth is coming out of just China, because China is absolutely choking on their smog pollution. They are highly motivated to make this conversion, but the U.S. is following pretty closely behind, and so is Europe. So you're seeing all of these increases. We are now seeing global plug-in vehicle deliveries of 2.1 million units in 2018, a growth of 64% just in that 1 year. That's worldwide. This is what it looks like in the United States. And the U.S. actually grew 81% last year, almost all of that growth due to a single car, the Tesla Model 3. A great vehicle, if I may say so. And so electric cars are just better in every way, except for range and the availability for refueling, and those are easy problems to solve. So those were the first two. Renewable electricity, electrify everything, and then the third and fourth one I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because I've spoken too long already, but we're talking about agricultural uses, farming practices, and the change to a sustainable food system. So those are all things that also have to happen. And you can read about the details of doing that in Drawdown. And I'll talk a little bit about what those Drawdown solutions look like very shortly. I saw this movie last night. It is a great movie. If you want to learn about regenerative agriculture and what we're talking about, it is the story of a couple that built a farm from scratch, regenerated some terrible looking soil in California, and are producing bountiful crops. It's playing in theaters right now. So that's what sustainable agriculture looks like. It's basically working in cooperation with Mother Nature, not using pesticides or other destructive farming methods. So I talked about Drawdown. Drawdown is a list of the 100 most important climate solutions. It's published in 2017 by Paul Hawken. He got together worldwide, 100 or more climate and energy researchers that did intensive investigation in looking at what are the most important solutions to the problem of the climate crisis. And they categorized them by how much carbon dioxide they would remove, how much they would cost to implement, or how much they would save if they were implemented. And that's what the solutions look like. This is number 1 through 15. These little NMs in red on the left margin are the ones that I think apply particularly to our state, because not every one of them does. For example, we don't have any tropical rainforests in New Mexico, but many of them do. And they're in categories like electricity generation, food production, land use, transportation, and these two here, which say women and girls, but they're really applying to the third world. It's making sure that young girls in the third world get enough of an education and enough autonomy so that they can control the size of their families. And population growth is a major factor. So that's number 1 through 15, and they're talking about planting more trees and taking care of peatlands and going to a plant-rich diet. Lots of things related to transportation, managed grazing. There's a lot of detail in there, and it's a great source, and people are really relying on it. So, the solutions are out there. That's my point with this one. So let's move to the politics, because we know what needs to be done. The benefits of doing it are staring us right in the face, and the damage that's being done by not doing it is extremely obvious. What's keeping in our way is politics and money. So let's talk about that. If we want to make these major changes, we're talking about changes in governmental policies. And the Sunrise Movement is one of those organizations led by young people that is pushing for this to happen. And they're doing great work in DC. This is an answer that I think had particular resonance to me by one of our best climate scientists, Michael Mann out of Penn State University. Somebody asked him on Twitter, if you could pick only one thing, whether it be a policy or technology, to solve the climate crisis, what would you choose? And his answer is, hold our policymakers accountable for climate-friendly policies through every form of leverage in a democratic society. And what that means for all of us is voting in every election, contacting your elected representatives and ask them what is their plan to save your future and your children's future, and demand that they do so. That means we have to be active. The opposition, of course, is all about money. The fossil fuel industry is about the most profitable industry in the history of industries. Together, oil, coal, and gas worldwide in just 2013, which is when this chart was put together, had a revenue stream of $2.9 trillion. That's not billion, that's trillion. That means $2,900 billion of revenue, and all of that is threatened by climate action because that oil and that coal and that natural gas has to stay in the ground. And they're going to stop selling it to us, and they don't like that. And they are literally willing to destroy your children's future so they can continue making those profits. That is literally true. That is their business plan. So we had some major progress in 2015, led by President Obama and many others. The world governments came together in Paris and signed a landmark climate accords that said we will at least start moving in the right direction. The agreements they made weren't strong enough, but they were a vital first step. Unfortunately, our current president has said he wants to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords. So that means that the momentum, the political action had to move to the states and the cities. And our governors and mayors in many states and cities have stepped up. There's something called the U.S. Climate Alliance, which has now listed 24 different states that have committed within their own state boundaries to following through and following the precepts of the Paris Climate Accords. Governor Lujan Grisham in New Mexico was one of the signers when she got elected. One of the first things she did. There are 400 climate mayors, which include Albuquerque, that have basically stepped up and said the same thing. That also includes Santa Fe and Las Cruces, so that's great. So it's important the momentum continue. It's just not nearly enough, or not fast enough, but at least it's happening. So at the federal level, when we have a different president and a different Senate, we will need to pass the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is an urgent 10-year national mobilization to save the climate and to restore equity. And it is a broad, comprehensive, and it is a solution that is large enough to really comprehend the source of the size of the problem. And it says that it is the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal to achieve, this list of goals and others, including, clean air and clean water, sustainable environment, eliminate carbon dioxide emissions of greenhouse gases, a clean, smart grid, building efficiency, on and on and on. And all of this needs to be done. If we're going to solve a problem that is as big as it is, that really literally threatens human civilization, this is the scale of the solution that we need. But it also includes a number of things that are more like New Deal projects from the 1930s that have a lot to do with reducing the amount of economic stress and provide a more improved safety net for all of our citizens. And you may not think that it is immediately obvious that creating high-quality union jobs and providing wages or ensuring fair business competition has much to do with solving climate change. But let me tell you why that has to be done. We are already seeing the effects of just a few climate refugees. 1 million coming from Syria, a few 100,000 coming from Central America. We're facing a future as the climate crisis gets worse and worse, where those numbers will get multiplied tenfold or 100-fold. And if we don't have a population that has enough of a sense of their own ability to have a future where they can take care of their children and can't feel like they can be generous to other people who will be looking to us to help them, we will just not be able to survive. There will be so much strife. The demagogues in our politics will use it, as they already are, to come to power and to prevent all of these solutions. And we will just not be able to survive as humanity worldwide. So there are many good reasons to do all of these things. That is one that has to do with our survival. So if you want to learn about the Green New Deal, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put together, along with some others, this great video. It's about 7 minutes long. I urge you to go find it on the internet and look at it. It's on YouTube for free. It's a message from the future about the Green New Deal. And I'm not going to play it, but it's really inspiring. So let's talk about direct action now. So there are so many people in the world, especially outside of the United States, but all over the world, now convinced that the climate crisis is an absolute emergency and we are almost out of time and we have to do something about it immediately. They are taking direct action. And so that includes a group called the Extinction Rebellion out of the United Kingdom, and they've been really active in London and throughout the UK, but it's also spread to the United States. And so this is an example of a die-in that was held in Rockefeller Plaza, where the protesters hung a sign that says that climate change is death, rebel for life. They hung that sign on top of my grandfather's statue and conducted a die-in right there, and their demands are, we're facing an unprecedented global emergency. The government has failed to protect us to survive. It's going to take everything that we've got. In the United Kingdom, they gathered outside of the Prime Minister's office and hurled buckets of fake blood on the street to emphasize the importance of the climate crisis, and have done many other things, including gluing their bodies, their hands, to the glass doors of the Shell Oil building in London. And they got the UK Parliament to declare a climate emergency about a month ago. And that was rapidly followed by the Parliament of Ireland, the second country in the world to declare a climate emergency. So, direct action works. We've gotten to the point where that's what it's going to take. That brings me to this enormously brave young lady, Greta Thunberg, a Swedish high school student who has been speaking truth to power for about the last year and a half, including things like this at the Global Climate Summit, where she said our civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a small number of people to continue making an enormous amount of money. And you adults are not doing anything about it. And I'm tired of it. And so she has led a school strike movement that started with just her and one sign outside of the Swedish Parliament, and it has exploded with young people worldwide. There have been climate strikes nearly every Friday ever since, and they grow and they grow and they grow. Their hashtag is Fridays for Future. If you're on Twitter, you can look that up. There is going to be a global climate strike on September 20th, and I'll tell you about that in just a moment. We had a school strike here in Albuquerque, a pretty big one, following a one in Santa Fe. About 200 high school and college students on May 3rd marched out of UNM down Central, blocking traffic, and they took over the intersection at Carlisle Central for about 45 minutes. It just completely shut down the intersection. That's what it takes. They got some coverage. And on September 20th, there's going to be a global climate strike. And it's up to all of us to help them, because, as Bill McKibben says, it's a little embarrassing that the middle school students are doing the heavy lifting on this one. So, mark this on your calendar. September 20th, we're going to ask everybody who cares to take the day off work, stop working for a day, that's what a strike is, and participate in climate events. There will maybe be a week-long series of events, and make sure that this is top of the mind, especially in our political system, so that we can take some action. Other things you can do, call your elected officials. It turns out that this handy little number in red, 520-200-2223, if you have a smartphone, if I have a volunteer from the audience that has a smartphone, raise your hand. All right. I want you to text this number. Basically what you do is you type in your home address and zip code to that number as a text message, and within 1 minute you will get a return text message that will include the number and names of your U.S. senators and representatives, contact information for your state senator, state rep, and your governor. And because you put in your zip code and your address, they know where you live and they know what district you're in, and they're going to find you. And so one thing you can do when you get that information is call them up and say, hi, my name is Tom Solomon, I live in your district. I've been learning about the terrifying changes that scientists predict for my future due to the climate crisis, the heat waves and wildfires and droughts, the hurricanes and flooding and sea level rise and famine and millions of climate refugees all predicted within my lifetime. If we don't change course, I want to know what your plan is to save the future and preserve a livable planet. Ask them this question. Hold them accountable. Don't accept bullshit for an answer. Other things that you can do, be the change. These are useful to do as your personal actions, but they are not nearly enough unless they're multiplied by politics. But they include things like being energy efficient with LED light bulbs, more efficient appliances, buying an electric vehicle, lowering your carbon footprint by installing solar panels, insulating your house so you use less energy, ride a bike, take the bus, dry your clothes. This is a real easy one. Does anybody have a clothes dryer, right? It's easy to just set it for 45 minutes and then you walk away and it tumbles your clothes, and the last 10 minutes they were already dry and don't need to continue to dry. A lot of dryers have moisture sensors on it. There's just a little button that you can push. It'll detect when it's done and stop on its own and stop wasting energy. Save it. So, and then this is something that we're going to roll out nationwide. It is actually live right now. If you go to werenew.net, New Mexico, this is a program to have social groups, church groups, you as an individual, look at your current uses of electricity and what you can do personally to reduce your consumption. You can challenge your church group to participate in this and form a little team and challenge your neighboring church group to be better than they are at buying or leasing an electric vehicle, installing solar panels and heat pumps and offsetting your air travel and turning your water temperature down. Many, many effects that you can see by just taking these small actions. It'll give you points, it'll tell you how much it's worth in terms of climate change. It's a great website. Coming soon. So, in summary, talk about the climate crisis. Know the basic facts. Probably the best website out there, the most accessible, is actually NASA. NASA.climate.gov. Hasn't been corrupted yet. Still got good information. Contact your elected representative. Demand a plan to save your future. And especially participate in debates, attend candidate forums, and ask them the question in public and make sure you get an answer. Vote for climate action candidates in every election. March and rally, take direct action, take to the streets, participate in the global climate strike on September 20th, and reduce your personal carbon footprint. So this is what I say to the climate denialists. So thank you. Any questions?